Philadelphia. For many, the cradle of liberty, the former capital of the United States where the country's history was written. But what if I told you that behind this patriotic facade lies a reality so sinister that it makes The Walking Dead look like child's play? Sounds like an exaggeration? Unfortunately, it's not. Here, you'll find entire streets dominated by people wandering like zombies, not searching for brains, but for their next dose. An area that was once industrial is now known for its improvised shacks and the constant presence of drug trafficking. While the historic downtown shines with postcard-worthy landmarks, there are urban corridors that have turned into ghost towns filled with homeless people and addicts. You might think Philadelphia is all about crowded stadiums, the Liberty Bell, and Rocky Balboa's famous steps, right? Well, get ready. Today, we will dive into the unfiltered reality of the Philadelphia no one wants to show you. First impressions. Located in southeastern Pennsylvania, between New York and Washington, D.C., Philadelphia carries a historical weight that's hard to ignore. After all, it was here that the Declaration of Independence was born, and where the iconic Liberty Bell became a symbol. And of course, who hasn't seen the famous steps of the Art Museum in the Rocky movies? But the city isn't just about history. Center City, for example, blends modern skyscrapers with colonial buildings, while artistic murals and diverse restaurants compete for visitors' attention. Philadelphia also takes pride in its culinary scene, the Philly cheesesteak. This sandwich of thinly sliced beef and melted cheese is as symbolic as the Liberty Bell itself. The rivalry between restaurants competing for the title of the best cheesesteak is almost a local sport. And when it comes to sports, Philadelphia doesn't mess around. Fans of the Eagles, NFL, and the Phillies, MLB, are known to turn the city into a massive celebration during game days. It's the kind of energy that makes anyone feel that Philadelphia is full of life. So far, it sounds like we're talking about a perfect city, right? But, as always, every coin has two sides. Behind this historical and cultural brilliance, there are problems many prefer not to see. While tourists snap selfies at Independence Hall, thousands of residents face a starkly different reality. And there's no way to talk about Philadelphia without mentioning the place that has become the symbol of this brutal contrast, Kensington Avenue. You know those scenes from zombie movies, with people staggering through the streets in a sense of total abandonment? That's exactly what you'll find there. 2. The rise and fall. As we mentioned earlier, Philadelphia was once the beating heart of the United States, a birthplace of independence and a hub of historic decisions. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the city experienced an industrial boom and was known as the workshop of the world. Textile, metal, and paper factories employed thousands, transforming the city into an economic and social powerhouse. Around these factories, particularly in the northern areas, working-class neighborhoods flourished, with bustling streets filled with people heading to and from work. For decades, Philadelphia thrived. But this golden age began to fade with the advent of globalization and the search for cheaper labor overseas. Large factories started to shut down, their massive structures abandoned, leaving those who relied on this economic model without hope. Slowly, unemployment became a constant shadow, leaving scars that persist to this day. While Philadelphia has managed to reinvent itself to some extent, strengthening universities and the service sector, the transition wasn't enough for everyone. The impact of deindustrialization split the city into two worlds, one wealthy, modern, and tourist-friendly, and the other marked by poverty and vulnerability. This divide defines the city today. 3. Concentrated poverty. Philadelphia holds an uncomfortable title. It's the poorest major city in the United States. If that sounds like an exaggeration, the numbers tell a clear story. Around 23% of the population lives below the poverty line. Even more shocking, nearly 1 in 10 residents live in extreme poverty. Inequality here is glaring. While downtown boasts gleaming skyscrapers, charming cafes, and trendy restaurants, the outer neighborhoods paint a very different picture. In the northern and western parts of the city, you'll find pothole-ridden streets, crumbling homes, and underfunded schools. It's as if there are two completely separate worlds within the same city. And this poverty isn't just a statistic. It's visible on the faces of those struggling to pay rent or put food on the table. Pennsylvania's minimum wage, stuck below $8 an hour, is barely enough to survive. Even those working 2 jobs find it difficult to live with dignity. Another reflection of this inequality is homelessness. Data shows that over a third of the homeless population in the metropolitan area lives on the streets of Philadelphia. While some face eviction or seek temporary shelters, others are forced to live in increasingly precarious conditions. And then there's Kensington, the neighborhood that symbolizes the worst of this reality. How did things get so bad? That's what we'll explore next. The beginning of the decline. Remember when we talked about factory closures, job losses, and globalization destroying local economies? That's exactly what happened here. In the 1970s and 80s, deindustrialization accelerated, turning once vibrant neighborhoods into urban wastelands. Factories that once employed thousands became ghostly relics, and Kensington was one of the hardest-hit areas. With jobs disappearing, local families lost their primary source of income. In no time, the neighborhood became synonymous with neglect, deteriorating streets, inefficient public transportation, and a complete lack of public investment. This abandonment didn't stop there. Schools suffered drastic budget cuts, reducing the chances of upward mobility for younger generations. Families with better means fled to the suburbs, leaving behind those who had no other options. In this bleak environment, drug trafficking found fertile ground. With no formal employment available, many residents turned to the underground economy. It wasn't long before traffickers transformed Kensington into one of Pennsylvania's largest drug markets. Heroin, crack, and later synthetic opioids began to flood the streets. Even before the current crisis, Kensington was known as a no-go zone. Police conducted occasional raids, but they never established a permanent presence to truly curb the drug trade. As legitimate incomes vanished, drugs became an escape for those who saw no other way out. This created a vicious cycle. Less employment meant more crime and addiction, which in turn brought more violence and scared away investment. By the late 1990s, the neighborhood had become a clear example of urban crisis. Yet, the situation back then pales in comparison to the chaos we see today. The opioid epidemic's grip. By the early 2000s, the opioid crisis hit Philadelphia with full force. What began with prescription painkillers soon escalated to heroin and, later, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin. Kensington became ground zero for this public health disaster. Open-air drug markets flourished. It's not unusual to see people injecting themselves in broad daylight or collapsing on sidewalks. Abandoned buildings became makeshift drug dens, and public spaces turned into dangerous, unsanitary zones. Despite occasional crackdowns, the flow of drugs never truly stops. For many residents, daily life is marked by fear and a sense of hopelessness. Emergency services are overwhelmed, responding to countless overdoses every day. Harm reduction programs, such as needle exchanges and safe injection sites, aim to prevent deaths. But critics argue these initiatives do little to address the root causes. Meanwhile, local organizations and volunteers work tirelessly to provide food, medical care, and pathways to recovery. But the scale of the crisis remains daunting. 6. The opioid crisis and Zombieland in broad daylight. If Kensington is now synonymous with chaos, it didn't happen overnight. Philadelphia is at the epicenter of an opioid crisis that began years ago when doctors started prescribing powerful painkillers indiscriminately. Over time, these medications opened the door to heroin and, more recently, fentanyl, a synthetic drug far more potent and deadly. In 2022, more than 1,000 people died from drug overdoses in the city, a record that clearly reflects the magnitude of the problem. But the situation worsened even further with the arrival of xylazine, a veterinary sedative used on horses that is now mixed with fentanyl and heroin. The effect is devastating: deep sedation, severe wounds on the body, and in many cases, necrosis. And what makes it even more complicated, xylazine is not classified as a controlled substance, making it difficult to regulate and enforce laws against its distribution. Additionally, since it is not an opioid, medications like naloxone, which are used to reverse overdoses, are often ineffective in these cases. What is the result? In Kensington, the scenes are chilling. People unconscious for days on the sidewalks, open wounds that make walking difficult, and an increase in violence as those under the influence of these drugs become easy targets for criminals. For local residents, this spectacle has become routine. They cross the street to go to the supermarket or pharmacy while trying to ignore what is happening around them, but always with the feeling that something dangerous could happen at any moment. What is most surprising? Not everyone living on the avenue uses drugs. Many of the makeshift shanties and tents are occupied by men, women, and the elderly who have never even smoked a cigarette, let alone used harder substances. And why do they live there? Because they have nowhere else to go. 7. Homelessness. Kensington is not only the scene of a drug crisis, it is also a reflection of the extreme homelessness problem that has overtaken Philadelphia. Underpasses and sidewalks are filled with makeshift tents occupied by people who have lost everything. Many have been pushed into this situation by economic hardships, job losses, evictions, or even family breakdowns. The neighborhood has become a final refuge for those who have no other place to go, an informal shelter that reveals the failure of public policies to provide long-term solutions. The statistics are chilling. About 17% of the homeless population are minors under 18 years old or young adults up to 24 years old. This underscores the lack of an effective social safety net, especially for the most vulnerable. In the harsh Pennsylvania winter, the situation becomes even more cruel. Reports of people dying from hypothermia or developing severe respiratory illnesses are common. All of this could be avoided if there were more accessible and adequate shelters. However, even the existing shelters present barriers. Families are often separated. Spouses and children cannot stay together. Additionally, strict rules, such as curfews and bans on substance use, keep many away. For some, facing the risks on the street is preferable to living in what they perceive as oppressive shelters. Poverty in Philadelphia is a cycle of barriers. Public transportation is inefficient, childcare is inaccessible for those who want to work, and rents are skyrocketing. Those who try to enroll in social programs face a maze of bureaucracy, while the streets of Kensington fill with shopping carts packed with belongings, sleeping bags, and trash. It is the daily portrait of a city coexisting with misery in its own backyard. 8. Temporary Band-Aids. If you're wondering whether the government has ever tried to solve the Kensington problem, the answer is yes, but always with solutions that were more like Band-Aids than real treatments. In recent years, several police operations have been conducted with impressive-sounding names like Operation Fishnet and Operation Sunrise, which became famous in the 1990s. These actions involved large-scale raids to arrest drug traffickers, seize drugs, and dismantle visible encampments. On paper, the goal was clear: to clean up the area and restore safety to residents. In practice, however, these efforts have always failed to address the root of the problem. The demand for drugs remained high, fueled by desperation and addiction, and drug trafficking simply continued. Beyond police action, there were attempts at social programs like harm reduction initiatives. Non-governmental organizations distributed clean syringes and naloxone, a medication that reverses overdoses. While these actions have saved many lives, there has been a lack of substantial investment in comprehensive treatment and long-term rehabilitation. The biggest problem is that the city has consistently offered only temporary fixes. Shanties were removed from one block, only to reappear on another. Users were evicted from one street, but there was no dignified place to relocate them. As a result, Kensington remained a powder keg, and with the arrival of synthetic opioids, the explosion was inevitable. 9. The 2024 operation. In 2024, Philadelphia city authorities decided to clean up Kensington Avenue once again. This time, the operation involved temporarily closing a section of the avenue to remove the encampments and tents that had accumulated on the sidewalks. The initiative gained attention in local media and was even mentioned in national newspapers as an important step toward reversing the area's degradation. For a few days, the avenue was taken over by cleaning crews who dismantled tents, cleared abandoned belongings, collected tons of trash, and attempted to direct those willing to go to shelters. The government announced that this action would be final, promising ongoing efforts to shelter the homeless and combat drug trafficking in the neighborhood. But in reality, the situation remained harsh. Many residents reported that after the cleanup, drug users simply moved to adjacent streets. Some relocated to the west side of the avenue, while others gathered under even more remote overpasses. The scenes of people staggering and using drugs, which have become a kind of negative trademark for Kensington, were still visible. Anyone passing through the area a few weeks after the tent removal would see that the problem remained intact, just spread to other locations. In other words, images of the cleared avenue gave the impression of a solution. But for those familiar with the local reality, it was nothing more than another media-friendly move. Drug trafficking didn't disappear, overdoses continued to occur, and just days after the famous operation, new photos circulated online, showing people in total unconsciousness. Amid so much pain, it is almost ironic to remember that Philadelphia was once the capital of the United States, the site of debates that paved the way for the country's democracy. The city of brotherly love, so named from the Greek roots of its name, Philos plus Adelphos, now displays a chasm. On one side is the historical and cultural heritage that fuels tourism and local pride. On the other, are neighborhoods turned into symbols of degradation and governmental neglect. And so we conclude another journey, this time exploring the hidden side of Philadelphia, the poorest major city in the United States. Now, I want to know, what surprised you the most? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.